Good evening and welcome to Worldview, the international affairs show that brings you the news and views that other networks can't or won't tell you about. I'm Alan Mendoza. Our show tonight, Arise Sir Salman. To what extent should international opinion influence domestic decision-making? This week, the Muslim world has been up in arms about the decision to award controversial author Salman Rushdie a knighthood. The Booker Prize-winning author had previously been placed under a fatwa in 1989 by Ayatollah Khomeini of Iran for his book The Satanic Verses, which was judged to have blasphemed against the Prophet Muhammad. Now, with Rushdie back in the spotlight, the Iranians have declared that the decision shows Britain's Islamophobia, and Pakistan's Minister of Religious Affairs has suggested that it will encourage terrorism. The Muslim Council of Britain considers it yet another example of insensitivity to Muslim opinion that will only result in their further alienation. So, coming hot on the heels of the cartoons controversy and the veil debate, is the Rushdie decision insensitive, Islamophobic, or merely the demonstration of British freedom of expression? And how much attention should be paid to international opinion and the views of faith communities when considering such artistic measures? Well, joining me tonight in the Worldview studio to unpick this topic are the contributing editor of Q News, the Muslim magazine, Abdul-Rehmen Malik, the director of English Pen, Jonathan Hoawood, and the director of the Centre for Social Cohesion, Douglas Murray. Well, gentlemen, we live in interesting times. Quite a ferocious reaction this week. I'm going to start with you, Jonathan, as there are rumours, and I don't know if you're going to substantiate this tonight, that English Pen were actually responsible for this nomination. I don't know whether you'd like to comment on that.
I'm sure you know it's just terribly infra-dig for any organisation or individual ever to confirm or deny
such
rumours, but we have been fingered by Michael White of The Guardian, among others, who suggested that this was on the evidence of a leak from well-placed government sources. So clearly there's an element of passing the buck. But I'm not ashamed to say that English Pen, and I'm sure other writers' organisations which have supported Salman Rushdie over the years, had lobbied for some kind of official recognition of his status as a writer. So on Saturday morning, I was delighted. The paper landed on the doormat. There he is, beaming out at me, all the charming expression as ever, and Arise Sir Salman, and we thought great news. Those of us who had supported him, clearly our voice has been heard, and call me naive, and I'm sure I'm about to be called naive, but at that moment I thought this was nothing but good news.
And it has since been proven otherwise. Now, Douglas, no one will ever call you naive. Could you foresee this coming the minute you heard the news?
No. You're always surprised by people who are willing to take offence at anything, by how low their bar of offence-taking indeed is. To my mind, who Her Majesty the Queen desires tonight is a matter for Her Majesty the Queen and her government. I don't see what is so wrong about Sir Salman Rushdie. I think it's a wonderful thing. I have to say I'm not the greatest admirer of his books. I think he's a very good writer, but I don't think that anyone could see this as being anything but a sign of independence on the part of the knighting commissions, or whoever is behind these things. It shows great independence, it shows great pluck, I think a good deal of sense, apart from anything else, if people are going to object to Sir Salman Rushdie. I'd love to know why they don't mind when the idiot Lord Ahmed is made a lord. Why should he be made a lord and Sir Salman can't be made a knight? Why Sir Salman Rushdie shouldn't be made a knight and, say, Sir Iqbal Sakrani should be, a man who said that death was too good for Salman Rushdie. If he can be knighted, then I certainly think Salman Rushdie should be knighted. I think it vaguely cancels out the evil of knighting Iqbal Sakrani and giving a peerage to the goon Ahmed.
Strong words, Abdul-Rehmen. Your view on the subject, do you agree with sort of Douglas's hard-hitting assessment there, or are you going to veer somewhere else?
Well, at Q News we've never been fans of Iqbal Sakrani, so I think we'd offer our agreement with you on that count. But I think it's just poor policy making is what's going on here. Whether he should be knighted or not is now a moot point. He's knighted, it's over, it's done. We have to deal with the fallout. But a government that is involved in a foreign adventure in Afghanistan, that is mucking things up in Iraq, that has completely messed up its role as part of the quartet in the peace process Israel-Palestine, ought to be thinking very carefully about the implications of even small decisions, particularly as these are stated foreign policy goals and objectives, and this administration hasn't done very well on foreign policy issues to begin with. So I think that's something that we certainly have to weigh and we certainly have to look at. Margaret Beckett's comments, I think, reported by Reuters today, that this was in fact an honor for Muslims. We're honoring Muslims, she said, vacuously, is just plain daft and
he
silly.
was honoured, and he was a Muslim.
Exactly. But this idea that somehow by honouring him, we are honouring all Muslims because here's a British Muslim writer is just plain stupid and not understanding really
Why doesn't
the
he represent?
sensitivities of the communities.
Why doesn't he represent Muslims in this country?
Because he's not a Muslim, first of all.
But a lot of people were born Muslims and aren't anymore.
Yeah, fair enough. But he's not. That's not his game. If you go back and look at Salman Rushdie, I think what was always honourable about him was this very straightforward, hard-hitting, a lot of the time anti-establishment, made the white establishment very, very angry and upset in the 1980s. The fatwa turned him into kind of a goon of the establishment and now an apologist for current debacles, including the war on terror and other things like that. But that for me, is absolutely secondary to the issue of whether or not this was good policy and met the government's old stated foreign policy objectives. And frankly, it didn't. Now the question, if we should be giving truck to people like Minister Ejaz in Pakistan and the Iranians, I mean, these were predictable reactions. I don't think we could have expected any different given the current political situation.
Okay, Jonathan, they're slightly ridiculous reactions, aren't they, from Iran and Pakistan, for example? I mean, it's predictable, but it's ridiculous at the same time. Should we be interested in what Iran and Pakistan have to say on this subject?
I think the real problem here is there are two completely incompatible and yet both accurate realities. As Douglas says, there's the reality of 21st century Britain, the establishment honouring a writer who, for the bulk of his career, was a fairly dissident voice, coming from the subcontinent, expressing a whole new kind of writing in the vanguard of what's now almost the dominant tradition of the kind of Booker Prize-winning Kiran Desai, polyglot, intertextual, Asian meets British, meets multiple identities novel, which is the dominant form. Salman Rushdie brought that in '82 with Midnight's Children. This could have been a great day, but for those few lines, perhaps, in his fourth novel, and but for the reaction which they garnered, he could have been and also, but perhaps for his personality as well, in courting controversy. This could have been a day in which a South Asian writer was honoured by the establishment. He doesn't, you know.
How do you think he courted controversy?
I think he did. At the time of the Satanic Verses, English Pen supported him almost as much as anyone could have done.
Quite right.
Offered
Absolutely.
him support, moral and material.
What did he do that was provocative?
I do remember at the time he did go on. I think he was invited to go on what was then the kind of Asian strand on BBC to talk about the Satanic. I mean, someone saw a kind of vaguely ethnic name and clearly thought, "Oh, we'll have him on." He proceeded to highlight the most controversial passages in the book. It's a book which is about many things, primarily about immigration and integration in Thatcher's Britain. It's a coruscating satire on Thatcher's Britain. I'm not saying in any respect he shouldn't have done that, but nor is he a man who has shied away from controversy. Let's put it that way.
I'm just sort of stating like that. I mean, the fact that nothing he did, nothing he wrote, is really controversial at all in the eyes of most people. In that he expressed an opinion quite densely shown in the book about a sort of form of satire of the Quran, which is fairly low, at a low level of the importance of the book, and makes a reference to Islam's prophet Muhammad. Says things which ordinarily would cause no fuss if you said them about any other religion. If you said them about Christianity, you'd join a great many people across the Western press saying, if you said it about anything else...
Including someone like Dan Brown. I mean, Dan Brown, in many ways, the blasphemies, if you call them that, in the Da Vinci Code are far greater than those in...
I mean, it seems to me that the only important issue here is why there are people who take such great offence at such small things.
Well,
I mean, you said earlier about the cartoons controversy. Isn't it ridiculous that we talk about the cartoons controversy?
But I think it's naive and it's plain having blinders on your eyes, not to recognize that these these incidents, whether it's the cartoon controversy, whether it was the time that the Satanic Verses was published, took place within broader geopolitical context. This is the globalized world we live in. The globalized world, really, which has been nurtured by writers like Salman Rushdie. I accept that, and I think that work in the early 80s was profoundly important in setting us all up to understand the nature of a globalized world. And that's why the reactions were the way they were. There's a broader political situation. There's an engagement between the Muslim Arab world and the West.
He's both prophet and victim of globalisation.
I
think that's a fair.
Let's look at this for a minute. Douglas has made a very interesting point here, which is he regards the Satanic Verses, for example, not having been offensive in the slightest. Do you regard them as having an offensive?
Oh, the possibility for offence is there, and I think offence...
They are there.
I think,
perhaps you can explain to the viewers at home why people might have found them offended.
I think clearly when the character and the person of the Prophet Muhammad was presented as the way it was in the Satanic Verses, him being as kind of a brothel owner, a false prophet, using very emotive historical language, calling him Mahound, which came very much from sort of Christian crusader talk against Islam and that sort of ancient Islamophobia. I think all of those things combine to create a strong sense of offense. But the fact is that in and of itself, it's not unique. Many people have offended the Prophet. Really, from the Muslim point of view, the Prophet has harmed very little, and our religion, which is a great tradition, spreading back 1,400 years, is harmed little as well. I think the real issue here is that an offense is caused within a certain political context. 1989, you were coming to the end of the Iran-Iraq war. There was a lot going on in Iran. The fatwa of Ayatollah Khomeini, at the time that it came, mirrored a lot of the frustrations in the Muslim world about Western engagement with the Muslim world. And it became a kind of a tinderbox of many different kinds of emotions. I think we have to accept that geopolitical reality. Same with the cartoon controversy. The cartoons would have been nothing had it not been for the backdrop of a perception within the Muslim world that there's a war against Islam and a war against the Muslim world.
No, hang on here a moment. The Danish cartoons would not have come to attention if there weren't a group of imams, two in particular, who decided to take offence and then take a world tour of taking offence. Decided to take a world tour of taking offence and show cartoons they'd also made up that were far more offensive than any of the other ones around to other people in order to whip up such sentiment. Ayatollah Khomeini, I don't think, was a reader of Salman Rushdie's early work. I don't think that Ayatollah Khomeini ever sat down with his copy of the Satanic Verses, his advance proof, and then decided to take offence. This is a man willing to take offence. He wanted to take offence. He wanted to whip up other people who don't read books and can't read any long book to take offence as well.
Within a particular geopolitical context, and same with the Danish cartoons. The fact that the Muslim community in Denmark, suffering apparent very public Islamophobia, very public pressure, racism, attacks on Muslim women and young people, attacks on mosques, vilification in the mainstream media. The cartoons didn't come out of the...
Vilification in the mainstream media in Denmark? The mainstream media in Denmark tiptoed around this issue, and might I add that this only came about...
The epistles of the DPP and others.
Well, I do read Gillian Posten,
for someone who wants to know social cohesion,
I certainly do know about Gillian Posten. I don't think... Well, hang on. What, Denmark is a racist country?
There is profound racism and Islamophobia.
You're just going to write off a whole country as racist? Do you think there's any racism in that?
It's an evident... I didn't say it's a racist country. I said there is racism in Denmark. That racism has been strongly felt by the Muslim community there. I've been to Copenhagen. I've spent time with the Muslim community there. The cartoons came out of a very specific local situation. Indeed, it was globalized.
They came out.
But the fact that those cartoons were picked up by the Arab media, by the press in the broader Arab world, was because they fitted it into a notion of a war of the West against Islam and Muslims. The fact that Iraq and Palestine provide a backdrop for that is just the worldview and the situation that we're in.
Look, no. Denmark, a country in which it was discovered that in a set of children's books about various religions couldn't depict Islam's prophet, in their book, and that no cartoonist wanted to do it. You want to talk about fear, you want to talk about racism. How about just being an illustrator in Denmark who feels their life's going to be on the line if they draw a picture for a kiddie's book? You want to talk seriously about how it feels to be scared, and then they do a cartoon for their local paper, and that their lives are under threat, and their families are threatened, and they have to go into hiding? You want to talk about what it is to feel threatened?
No, I think that's absolute exaggeration. 3 years earlier,
Well, you can go
that
and
same
speak to Fleming
newspaper was
Rose.
presented with offensive cartoons of Jesus. Those cartoons were rejected because the Jyllands-Posten said they would cause offense. Why weren't the same standards applied here? And in fact, let's just move on from that. The question of the children's book is a rather silly pretense for the editors of Jyllands-Posten going ahead and commissioning these cartoons, which ultimately we all know weren't really about the Prophet Muhammad at all. They were about people's perceptions of Islam and about Muslims in Denmark and in the world. And the impact of those cartoons had a ripple effect because we live in a globalized world.
So it's a perception aspect that's key here. Jonathan, this is interesting. Given that the contention here is essentially that it's perceptions that matter, although you've defended Salman Rushdie's work, English Pen have defended it, should more consideration have been taken about this? I'll give you an example today. Stuart Jackson MP, who heads up the Pakistan Committee in the House of Commons, said that it was perhaps not the wisest thing to have given him a knighthood, given that the reaction of Pakistan would destabilise that country. And, Pakistan is quite unstable at the moment. Is that in Britain's foreign policy interest? So should we actually be taking more into account the international situation, or are the two completely unrelated, and domestic considerations should come first, in a sense, and you should award this man knighthood for literature? And forget about the rest.
Sadly, as I said, whilst English Pen may be able to nominate people for knighthoods, we don't actually sit over the appointments procedure, otherwise we'd all be Sir Jonathan.
Sure, but do you think, just in general, that given the
people.
reaction, that foreign policy or international opinion should be taken into account?
Of course, international opinion, foreign policy should be taken into account in domestic policy. It's the job of government to balance competing interests. But I do think there's a problem when the simple name Salman Rushdie, to millions of people who have no awareness of his work, stands as almost a fetish or a taboo, a totem name, rather like the name Princess Diana, now signifies something way beyond anything she ever meant, said or did in her life. And as her brother recently said, this is never going to go away. The Diana phenomenon will be with us like the Marilyn Monroe phenomenon, the JFK phenomenon. Balmy conspiracies will continue to circle her life. So with Salman Rushdie, I think whenever his name comes up in the international media, in the Middle East and in South Asia, this will be the reaction. Should the government then take that kind of totemic status into account when looking at the canon of contemporary great British writers and thinking we have a certain number of honours to give in this area, we want to reward someone for their commitment to literature over 30 years, should they say, well, let's not do that one, because he means something far more than the sum of his parts to 1.5 billion, supposedly 1.5 billion Muslims?
It can't be stressed enough how little you take notice of the opinions of people who hate and then burn books they don't read. Such people are not people whose opinions you should be considering.
This is Douglas totalizing again and placing his vast generalization on an entire group of people, which is absolutely ridiculous.
But it is true that the reaction has been... Just look at the cartoons control, the reaction, death threats, boycotts and all this.
There's definitely a very, very strong reaction. And I can't state enough that comes out of a particular political context. Yes, there is offense. There's no doubt about that.
Whose fault is that political context?
People have the right to be offended.
Whose fault is that political context? Just to check. Are you saying that's the fault of, for
well,
instance,
I think it's
like
actually
Britain?
many reasons. It's the fact that we're going off on foreign adventures into Iraq, which are failing. We're not helping the Israel-Palestinian situation.
So
we have double standards between the way in the way we behave in the Middle East and the Muslim world. The fact that Afghanistan is a mess, in a large part of the fact that we've really mucked up there.
Let me get this straight. Hang on. Let me get this straight.
So you think? Let me finish. Let me answer the question. So we've gone into these foreign adventures. They've been an absolute disaster. We've exacerbated we've exacerbated a situation where there's a definite feeling of us against them. The Britain's support for the so-called and ridiculous war on terror has caused a terrible backlash in the Muslim world. If our policy objective is to build good relations with the Muslim world, then this knighthood was a bad decision. But now it's happened. It's done. It's done. My personal opinion is just be quiet. So let him have his little bubble. He is largely irrelevant now. He's made himself irrelevant. He's lost his edge, Salman Rushdie has. So let him go quietly off into the into the night with his knighthood and let him reside in New York because he's given up on Britain in the
I think
first
one
place.
of the ironies, really, that this case has revealed, because I mean, you say one priority of the government is to have harmonious Muslim relations. It's one among many priorities, and another maybe is to have a thriving, vibrant cultural scene in this country, and surprisingly...
But does this really help it? Does this knighthood help that
I
thriving
think
cultural
it
scene
doesn't
of an author who's left these shores?
I think it does. Well, he's left for many reasons, but I think it does send out a pretty clear message to younger writers, to people like Gurpreet Kaur Bhatti, who wrote the play Bejti, which was stormed off the stage in Birmingham. Another colleague of hers, Yasmin Whittaker Khan, who wrote a play about the Mujra, the dancing houses in Britain, who has been subject to terrorist threats. This is not just a kind of British Asian phenomenon. Gary Mitchell, the Northern Irish playwright, was firebombed out of his home. His relations were targeted by the UDA for comments he'd made in his plays about that culture, from which he comes himself, the North Belfast loyalist Protestant background. If playwrights like that, if novelists, filmmakers, screenwriters, TV producers get the message that actually these considerations, this fear mustn't predominate over the need to produce new, original, groundbreaking, honest work. That's a very positive
statement. I think, Jonathan,
statement.
that kind of stuff, films, books, literature, art, is being produced. I talked to Yasmin Whittaker Bell when Bells came out, and it's a pretty shocking play, and I reviewed it, and then reviewed it quite positively, because I think it's reflecting some of the deep cultural issues on the ground. I think that's not the issue. The issue is this particular knighthood a good decision? I don't think it was.
No, the issue is not that. The issue is whether or not, in a free society like Britain, we have the right to say what we want, and to write what we want, and to not be censored, not be killed, not be forced into hiding, not be the subject of fatwas by evil old men.
But essentially, there's a point in this, because although you said earlier, yes, okay, this issue's done, finished, there's going to be another issue, isn't there? There will be. If someone, somewhere, for some reason, does insult the Prophet Muhammad, there will be another
You just call him a
reaction.
prophet.
Yeah, there may or may not be.
Well, he is a prophet.
There may or may...
Is he? Do you believe so?
Well, I believe he's a prophet to Islam, yes.
Well, you can just call him Muhammad. If you don't believe him, don't call him the Prophet Muhammad.
Well, all right.
Why do you recognise as a prophet?
Call him
It's a
Islam's
recognised
Prophet
term.
Muhammad. Call him Islam's
Do you
Prophet.
think Salman is now actually a knight on shining armour? I mean, it's
No, I say you don't need to call him.
are
You
ultimately
don't need to
words.
call him your prophet if he's not your prophet.
I don't
He's
think
not my
calling
prophet,
him his prophet, but that's
Yes.
an absolute aside.
Yes, but it's going to happen again, though,
There
isn't
may
it?
be offence again. There may not be offence again. I think
But Douglas is right in that sense, isn't it? The point is, it's about people's freedom of expression to say that someone who doesn't, for example, believe that Muhammad is a prophet, why can't they say that, for example? And
I think they are saying it, and people are saying it, and there's enough out there about people saying it quite vociferously and openly, and saying all kinds of...
I don't know.
All
I
kinds, saying all
I'm
kinds
not-
of ridiculous things
In the
in the
artistic
mainstream and
sector,
outside.
I'm-
People are saying it.
I'm
I
not
think
seeing
the
it.
issue here is not a question of freedom of speech. The issue here is whether this is a good decision or not. That's essentially the issue. The issue is not freedom of speech. Someone recently published his book. The book was not curtailed in this country. And talking about censorship, I think...
Hang on, the paperback was curtailed. Hang on, the paperback was
Simon
curtailed.
Jenkins, during the Danish cartoon controversy, made a very important point, is that as journalists we ought to understand, is that we make decisions every day to censor ourselves, to curtail what we say, to choose the kind of stories that we report, and to choose the way in which we report
The
them.
knighthood demonstrates the fact that the Queen and the British government do not award knighthoods on the basis of what a rioting mob will think in Pakistan or in Tehran.
And we'll end on that point at that moment to discuss. Jonathan, you have a piece for us.
I brought in a piece. You asked us to bring in pieces
Yes.
which haven't really got the coverage. Perhaps
Tell me more.
They deserve. This one has barely had any media coverage. In fact, the best place I could find the information on it was on our own English Pen website.
Good plug there.
So a little bit of shameless plugging. But this is a continuation of the story which really dominated the news in Turkey and across the world for a few weeks in late January this year, when Hrant Dink, the editor and publisher of the Turkish-Armenian newspaper Agos, was assassinated outside his office in Istanbul. He'd been in the middle of protracted court proceedings for this, what is called Article 301, the Turkish Penal Code, insulting or denigrating Turkishness, for remarks he'd made several years earlier, referring to the Armenian genocide. Now, the shocking thing is that that case continues. The case had
Even though he's dead.
Even though he's dead, the case has been pending since July 2006. His co-defendants, including his son, Arat Dink, who's the new managing editor of Agos, were in court last week. Arat continues to face charges. Whenever now they try to refer to the case, they face further charges. because not only is denigrating Turkishness a crime, but attempting to prejudice the court is also supposedly a crime, and referring to the case in the newspaper is seen as contempt in Turkey.
Well, it's an interesting, yes, parallel between the Rushdie case and this, for example. Now, Abdul-Rehmen, what's going on here? Why are we hearing so much about Rushdie, for example, but not about the Herat Dink?
We should be hearing a lot more about this case, and I think the case fits in broadly into a major problem that's going on in Turkey right now, is that the similar articles that are being used against Herat Dink are the same articles that are being used to protect an arch-secular fundamentalist state, and that are seeking to ossify freedom of opinion on many, many levels. And I think what's needed is a reformation of the whole laws around freedom of expression in Turkey, whether it's related to Islam and religion, whether it's related to those people speaking about the Armenian genocide, or we shouldn't forget the fact that Kurdish people who have not been allowed to utilize their language, who have not been allowed to publish in their own language, whether those texts are secular or religious, that kind of prevention is absolutely condemnable.
Douglas, what have you got for us?
Well, two things quickly, I suppose. One is the interesting news today, a launch at the House of Commons of the Association of Ex-Muslims, which I thought was an interesting meeting and an interesting development, that there are now a group of people who feel confident enough to band together and say that they're not believers, and they are, in the words of Muslims, I suppose, apostates, and they're open about this, and I think that it's a good move. It's a good move when anyone feels that they can say what they believe, and to do so with freedom, impunity, and without fear of threat. So I'd mention that, and I'd also mention the very good and exciting news of the death of Bernard Manning, which I think is a great development this week and a great success and pleasure for Britain.
Jonathan, Bernard Manning, freedom of expression, do the two exist there?
There is, yeah. This is the thing about freedom of expression. It's a very uncomfortable zone often to work in. I mean, fortunately, I was never called on to defend Bernard Manning.
Extraordinary.
You've never taken up the English pen.
He wasn't one of our main cases. I think he could handle himself. Was essentially the picture. It's almost worth referring those to the Emily off Big Brother fiasco. I mean, there's a kind of culture there which Endemol and Channel 4 were using Emily, whose comments I think, taken in context, were meant very innocently as a scapegoat to cover their own backs off the back of Shilpagate.
Yeah.
And to work on that way. But Abdul-Rehmen, your piece. What have you
last week, the piece is from the Wall Street Journal. It's an obituary. It's the death of the great Senegalese filmmaker Ousmane Sembène. Ousmane Sembène is known as the father of African cinema on a continent where in most countries less than a dozen films are produced a year. Sembène's work was marvelous, and in terms of the tenor of our debate today, he was a great proponent of free expression. His last film was on the terrible practice of female genital mutilation. He himself was born in a Muslim family, went to a Quranic school, became a Marxist for a time, and then found a happy medium between all those parts. And I think it's a great loss to African cinema. It's a great loss to world cinema. And we just hope that the children of Sembène will continue his magnificent legacy.
to do so? And it's interesting that you have someone coming out from Africa with such a strong, with that background, similar to Ayaan Hirsi Ali, who I know you know very well, Douglas, in terms of another person who's had freedom of expression but has had a very different response to that, I take it. I mean, I take it that in this instance there weren't sort of rioting mobs having a go.
You know, what's interesting about Sembène is that there was a lot of really harsh reaction on the streets to his work, but I think now, decades later, there's an understanding that he was reflecting a lot of the social milieu of the time and really trying to advance real arguments about where Africa was going, and he saw cinema as the way to do it because Africa is this great, sweeping, diverse, colourful place, and it requires almost cinema to capture it in its all its glory.
Excellent. Well, that was their view. This was indeed Worldview. After 2 weeks of culture, we're going to go back to hardcore foreign policy next week. Join us then.